On his way back home from the gate, Ojin stops off at Wick D's and orders 2 Big Macs for $16. After receiving his order, he continues walking holding the bag in the air and with a disgruntled expression, and he couldn't help but lament in his heart, and says, "Why the fuck are these burgers so goddamn expensive?" As he walks through the door of his house and calls out, "I'm home." While removing his shoes at the entrance, he hears a feminine voice answering back, "Oh? You finally made it back?" In a lazy but tired tone, Ojin replies by saying, "Yeah, I am home," and flicks on the lights. As the room gets brighter, he sees a redhead sitting up in bed with a relieved smile on her face and says, "You are a little late today, aren't you?" This is Song Haun. She was the only support that Ojin had while growing up in the orphanage. With a goofy grin plastered all over her face, and she raises her 2 fingers and says, "Now that you're back, how about you give me a cigarette? Hurry up. Why are you just standing there giving me that look?" And with a sigh and an annoyed expression, Ojin just says, "The second I walk through the door, and you are already spouting bullshit." With a snicker, she giggles and says, "Oh ho, what do you mean by bullshit? Is that how you talk to your elders there, young man?" As Ojin was digging out a burger from the bag, he sneers and says, "Elder? PFT. My ass, you're an elder." Giggling to herself, she says, "I am 2 years older than you, so that would make me your elder, no?" Completely ignoring her banter, Ojin places a burger into Haun's hands and says, "Here, I bought some burgers," which makes Haun's face brighten up like a little child receiving candy and says, "Thanks." Song Haun is an awakener, but she ended up getting injured and lost her right leg and went completely blind, so in order to repay her for all the support that she has given to Ojin in the past, he has decided to take care of her and be her pillar in return. A long time has passed since they both lived at the orphanage together, and now they live together in this apartment. But every day their bond is growing stronger and stronger, which at times can be emotionally dangerous and a tad bit awkward at times. After Haun takes a bite out of her burger, she asks Ojin with a tone that was completely serious and says, "Hey Ojin? What is this?" Which confused him greatly and replies by saying, "Huh? What are you even talking about?" With a happy and excited expression plastered on her face, like she hasn't tasted anything like it before, and says, "Oh my god. Why is this so goddamn delicious?" Ojin just looks at her with amusement, and says, "That's because I bought it fresh, instead of the normal frozen ones." Which make Haun bellow out, "What? Did you get hurt or hit your head? Maybe you received a little bit of brain damage or something?" Which only made Ojin sigh, "It's because I have earned a little extra tonight." Which make Haun counter-reply by saying, "It's not like you haven't had extra money before." Ojin just says, "Well," and then he goes into deep thought and thinks to himself, "There is something very important that I need to buy. Only need to save up just a little bit more." As he looks at Haun that is staring back at him with a questioning gaze and with sauce smeared on her cheek, he just ends up completely ignoring her question and says, "By the way, you have sauce smeared all over your face." Which makes Haun panic and exclaims out loud, "What? Really? Where?" While panicking and feeling self-conscious, she grabs the soda that Ojin places into her hand and yells out, "Hey! You could at least tell me where it is." Ojin just chuckles with a bit of amusement and says, "You don't have to worry about it, just eat, because either way, you are still ugly, with or without shit smeared all over your face." As he sits back down and still snickering, he then says, "I will start buying these burgers from now on, instead of those prepared frozen ones, and by the way, the burger that you just had all over your face is actually called a Big Mac, and also..." As Ojin starts to go off on a tangent, Haun notices something off, and asks, "Hey Ojin? Did something happen today?" As she gazes at Ojin, as if to say, "You better not fucking lie to me." He just stares at her and says, "Yeah, you could say that something has happened," as he thought to himself, "Fuck, she has sharp intuition, I really can't keep anything from her." He then leans forwards, placing his elbows on his knees, and just tells her straight, "I have awakened." Everything just went silent, an awkward silence, as he just stares at her for a response. After a little while she responds by saying, "You did what?" and drops her soda onto the bed, which spills its contents all over the sheets. As the scene changes, Ojin is sitting on the swings and sighs, thinking to himself, now that is over and done with, I can finally have time to relax. As he closes his eyes and feels the cool night breeze brushing past his face and thinks to himself, it has gotten quite late from her harsh interrogation, but I guess it were to be only natural for her to be so surprised. With a grim expression while thinking back, how exactly would a person begin to explain to his childhood friend that he is scamming a goddess and impersonating a regressor, all at once? Shaking his head and pushes everything to the back of his mind and thinks to himself, I guess it's time to digest and go over everything, as he pulls up all his notifications. The first thing he obtained was his innate ability called Black Heaven, and the second thing is his trait, which has 3 additional properties. The first is called Stigma Absorption, which can absorb other people's stigmas mana and store it inside Black Heaven. The second is called Black Curtain, which allows Ojin to hide all the other stigmas that he possesses. The third ability is called Transmission, which allows the user to read some memories of the previous stigma holder, to a certain degree that is based on the awakening stage. And the last thing is called Possess Stigma, which can designate any stigma to be the main stigma. As Ojin thought back to the time where he had the conversation with the goddess, he could remember that Vega had told him that the person who owns Black Heaven would bring ruin to the world. As he brought his hand to his chin and thought, so sometime in the future, I would be the one to bring destruction to the world. As he tries wrapping his head around the whole ordeal, getting tired of thinking so much, he just rubs his head violently from feeling frustrated and couldn't help but wonder, just what the hell happened to me in the other timeline? As he strokes his hair back while in deep thought, no matter what, and by any means, I can never get caught, because the moment that they find out that I have the ability to absorb stigmas, then they will know that I have Black Heaven, and then everything would be revealed to them. As Hei lets out a long and heavy sigh, he couldn't help but lament inside, just why the fucking hell did I have to get dragged into all this mess? As he wraps his arms around the chains of the swing, he then leans backwards and thinks to himself, putting all that aside, the real problem now is how am I going to move forwards from here on out? As he gazes at the moon while the light reflects off of his eyes, in deep contemplation, and says, a regressor, huh? Just what can I do to make me seem more like a regressor? For now, I guess I could start by removing any and all suspicions from Vega, by getting her to acknowledge me, and to do that, I would have to increase the strength of my stigma, by gaining more stars. As he sits up and places his hand over his stigma and thinks out loud, there is already a ton of mana stored inside Black Heaven, so the next major thing to do would be to increase the proficiency and skill handling of the constellation's power. As he looks back up at the moon in thought and says, I guess it will be another gate run tomorrow. In that case then, I guess it would be time to head to bed, as he gets up from the swings and starts walking. He receives a notification on his phone. As he scrolls through the articles, he notices a particular article that caught his attention, that mentions a certain dungeon, located in Sinhyungdong, that had an anomaly. Groups of over 20 ant horns herded together that had created multiple victims inside the gate, which makes Ojin think to himself, an anomaly? Hey, was that not the gate that we went into earlier? So that was the reason why there were so many of them grouped together. A mutant, huh? In a gate, there is a low chance of a mutant monster spawning, even though it is a very low chance of it happening. That only makes them more unique and stronger than their normal counterpart monsters. And in some cases, they get an ability that allows them to control a horde monsters. As he thought back to the time where he was swinging and waving a twig at them, trying to fend them off, he couldn't recall ever seeing one present, but it wasn't exactly like he was in the right mind to pay any attention to those details. As he thought about it for a bit, he starts laughing with a demented smile and says, it looks like my destination has already been decided for me. As the scene changes to the next day, as he was walking around near the gate, he could hear some stronger individuals calling out for some new members to join up to party, and the weaker ones are yelling to be luggage carriers. As Ojin just strolled around with his arms behind his back like he's on vacation, he was observing his surroundings and couldn't help but think to himself, Even though they announced that no one should enter the gates, there seems to be even more people here than usual. As Ojin just stood there pondering with his fingers on his chin like he is some wise sage, deciding whether or not he should team up with other individuals just to be safe, but ultimately his greed won over in the end. So eventually he finds himself standing in the middle of the gate, alone, with one hand on his hip and another gripping his glaive that is hung over his shoulder, while yelling, "Let's get this fucking party started, shall we?" As he was walking through the forest and parting shrubs off to the side, he ends up stopping just before a tree, because he felt some presences lurking and trying to creeping up behind him, so he grips his glaive that was strapped to his back. Just as he turned around, like a symphony of growling and barking, he noticed that he was getting rushed at by multiple ant horns. And just as he was about to take a stance, he noticed another bastard sneaking up from behind him. So he grips his glaive and uses his blunt end and smashes it down on top of the ant horn's head and gets pummeled into the ground. After finishing the one-sided beating, he noticed he was about to get pounced on from behind, once again. Ojin then dodges the pounce by ducking under the ant horn, which makes the monster flies over him. And just as the ant horn was about to land, it felt as if something was off, so it tried to turn around to take a look, only to notice that Ojin had gripped his hind leg. While holding the ant horn upside down with one arm, Ojin then looks down at the other monster, that has his head pressed into the ground and feeling aggravated. He says, "And where the fuck do you think you're going? If you guys are going to come at me, then..." He lifts his leg and stomps down onto the head of the ant horn, making it blow up into chunks that flew in all directions. And then he looks at the one that he is still dangling in the air and yells, "And you should pay the fucking price," as he shifts his center of gravity and does an overhead throw, and like a bullet, the ant horn gets launched through the air, directly towards his four brethren. That takes them all out, as if he were using monsters to bowl with, which makes smoke and dust float through the air. As Ojin looks down at his hands and with a mixture of feelings, that is between shock and disbelief, he could only think that this just proved his hypothesis: he is definitely stronger than the average one-star awakeners. To be able to lift and throw an ant horn with just one arm, as he looks over at all the damage he has caused from the improvised ant horn rocket, it is definitely no simple feat. As he looks at all the dead bodies on the ground and his greed kicked in and pushed everything to the back of his mind, as he crouches down and thought, "Now this is where the money lies," and starts removing the star stones from all the dead bodies. With the last star stone removed, he pinches the stone between two fingers and held it above his head and directs some light, as he inspects the quality of the sparkling and gleaming stone through his squinted eyes and says, "Yup, this is definitely worth about 8K, and because of these babies I can see why everyone would want to become an awakener." After collecting all the stones, he hears some rustling bushes behind him. He slowly stands back up and wipes the dirt off his clothes and says, "Now then." He looks over his shoulder with a mocking smile and says, "What happened? Did you come rushing back because you smelled the charred remains of your little friends?" As Ojin just stares at this behemoth, with blazing red energy from either being a mutant, or just from anger from being mocked at and getting his underlings slaughtered. Ojin watches the mutant just standing there, growling. He chuckles to himself and says, "Yup, this is definitely a mutant." Just then, the mutant lets out a loud roar, and charges directly at Ojin as if he were a boar. Snickering with amusement, Ojin starts taunting the monster by saying, "Oh?" With his hand gripped onto his glaive he says, "Are you serious? You're just going to charge at me like that? And here I thought mutants were smarter than the others. Or is it because you are mutant that you have no fear?" Ojin just takes a step back and stretches his right arm behind him, and with all his strength for another throw, he then looks at the monster as if it were already dead and says, "Well then," as his Lyra's stigma starts to glow on his chest, and activates his level 1 skill, Thunderfall. His eyes then start to glow with a blazing blue electric energy, and then bellows, "You should get a solid beating," and launches the glaive that was coated with the same blue energy at the mutant. As it soared through the air, like a blue beam cannon, and blasted the mutant into pieces. After everything settled down, Ojin was frozen still with his arms still stretched out, and completely confused with flabbergasted expression on his face as he thought, I knew I was stronger than the average awakeners, but did it seriously get murked just like that? A single hit?